is an initiative of the Humanities Program, which seeks to bring in scholars, teachers, artists, journalists, all those kinds of people from around the country, even around the world sometimes, to share their work with you and to introduce you to new ideas, to help you think about things differently, to deepen your appreciation for the humanities. I'm going to give this microphone to my colleague Aaron Schmidt in just a minute to introduce our guest, but let me lay down the rules for you real quick. If you've been here before, you should know them by now. Rule number 1, those screens are gone until 4:45. You don't need them out. Rule number 2, once we get to the Q&A, a student asks the first question, right? So have those wheels turning as you're listening. Rule number 3 is more like a strong suggestion, which is that you really should take advantage of the reception immediately after this in the great room. What do you call it? Breaded shrimp thing to get your weekend started right. So I think that's all I needed to tell you. So let me pass this microphone now to Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for giving me my doctorate. I appreciate it. Great. Thank you all. So glad you're here. I think you're in for a real treat. So I'm just going to introduce Dr. Schvey and give you a little bit about his background. So Henry Schvey is an emeritus professor of drama at Washington University in St. Louis, where he has taught since 1987. And Henry arrived at WashU as chair of the Performing Arts Department and served in that position for 20 years until 2007. Prior to coming to WashU, he taught at Leiden University in the Netherlands as a professor of English and American literature. And while living in the Netherlands, Henry founded Lest, which was the Leiden English-speaking theater, and was the artistic director of that touring Dutch company until moving back to the United States. Henry is a stage director, memoirist, and playwright, as well as a scholar of modern American and European drama. His memoir, The Poison Tree, was published in 2016. A play, Tennessee Kissed Me, was recently selected winner of the Playwriting Initiative at the Tennessee Williams Festival in St. Louis and is scheduled to have a stage reading later this fall. He has published essays on Edward Albee, David Mamet, Arthur Miller, Sam Shepard, and Lanford Wilson, among others. A recent book, Blue Song, St. Louis in the Life and Work of Tennessee Williams, was published in 2021, while another, The Plastic Theater of Tennessee Williams, is scheduled to be published by Edinburgh University Press in 2027. And his talk on Summer and Smoke is based on his research for this forthcoming book on Williams and the visual arts. So I would like to welcome Dr. Henry Schvey.
Welcome, everybody, and I'm glad you moved down a little bit so that I don't have to sort of go quite so far. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, good. Happy Halloween. I thought about something like a Tennessee Williams outfit, but I don't know that it would be that compelling. I think, honestly, that college students come to a lecture on Tennessee Williams instead of preparing for trick-or-treating is quite an honor. And Tennessee Williams would certainly have been shocked, but I think delighted that you chose to come and hear something about him. Thank you, Ian and Aaron. It's a great honor to be invited to offer this Humanities Forum lecture at Providence College and to follow in the footsteps of so many distinguished speakers. And it's also been a privilege to partner with Aaron Schmidt and the talented cast and crew of Summer and Smoke. I saw the production last night, and you're crazy if you miss seeing it. It's really, really very, very strong theater, beautifully designed, costumed, lit, and the acting is first rate. So I really insist that you guys do go. They're even taking a day off today, which probably is a good thing given the stresses of an opening. So, and I also want to thank, in addition to Professor Ian Bernhoft, Ms. Pamela Belcher for her administrative efforts in making the humanities lecture, my humanities lecture, a reality today. So I'm very appreciative. Okay, now to begin. It seems fitting that we are here to discuss this play at Providence College. The college defines itself as a place for seekers. And Summer and Smoke is a play about a young woman, Alma Winemiller, and I can't help looking at the actress who played it, who is playing it, Alma Winemiller, who is on a spiritual quest. For readers of the text of the play, this quest is signaled by an epigraph. I'm sure that most of you students know, but an epigraph is a quotation at the very, very beginning of the play. And this one comes from a poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, and in English, who wrote in German, but the translation is very relevant, it seems to me, to this notion of spiritual search. Who, if I were to cry out, would hear me among the angelic orders? The play may end with Alma bidding farewell to the statue of the stone angel of Glorious Hill, with which she is identified throughout. But her quest, I would surmise, continues beyond the frame of the play. It's interesting, we had a class this afternoon about this very question, about what happens after the play. And I think it's a great tribute to the director and to the cast of the play that we were having this conversation, that people cared and they wanted to know what is the sort of afterbeat. Where does Alma go after she connects with a young gentleman? And if you haven't read or seen the play, and I'm sure many of you here haven't, I think it'll become clear in the context of this talk what I'm referring to. Another aspect of this notion of serial quest is Alma's name. It's appropriate for a woman whose first name means soul, as we're told, and whose last name, Winemiller, evokes an allusion to the Christian Eucharist in its combination of wine and bread, Miller. Now, I want to just forget my remarks and talk to the students, particularly for a moment, that are here. If someone asked you the question, where were you born? What would you say? What would be your answer? Would somebody like to speak up? Just tell me, where were you born? Okay. So most of us would give an answer, a straightforward reply to that question, where we were born, where is the city or country of our birth. But if you were asked instead, where are you from? Would the answer be the same? Maybe it would. Maybe it would be the same. But in some cases, you might respond to that question quite differently. Can anyone think of a different response to that question? If you were asked where you were born, and then you were asked where you're from, if you would answer the same in both cases, would anyone like to answer it? Yes. Okay. Yeah. And this gentleman, you were going to say something? A technical difference. Yeah. Anything else? As far as responding, yes. So what would they be? If you don't mind sharing, I don't mean to be nosy. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's, okay, that I understand. So you would respond differently depending on how long you lived in the city of your birth, or whether you chose to identify with some other place that may or may not be your birthplace, right? So I'm just inviting you to think about that question. And, you know, the students here are reasonably young, so they may not, maybe you're from here and you would answer that, but I think this is the response that I think is interesting, where there's a distinction between the two. These are questions we routinely ask meeting someone on campus for the first time, don't we? Where are you from? Where were you born? Where are you from? However, I believe this trivial question, and I think we can agree that it's fairly trivial, except in this gentleman's case, that's all right, is directly relevant to Tennessee Williams and to why he wrote Summer and Smoke in the way that he did. And I hope that this too will become clear. Thomas Lanier Williams, he was not born Tennessee, was born in the Deep South in Columbus, Mississippi. He was born in 1911. There won't be a test. And he spent his very earliest years growing up in the small town of Clarksdale at his grandfather's rectory. But at the age of 7, his life changed significantly. His family moved abruptly to St. Louis, Missouri, and the move proved decisive. Williams was never happy in St. Louis, and his earliest memory of that then Midwestern industrial city, it was known as the shoe capital of the world at the time, was being slapped by his father for stealing grapes from a fruit vendor at Union Station as a child. We'll see later a slide juxtaposing the train station of Clarksdale, Mississippi, with the Union Station in St. Louis, and you'll get a clearer sense of what I mean. When in later life Williams was asked where he was from, he invariably omitted his Midwestern connection and proudly informed people that he was from Mississippi. And in the playbill biography, you know, the little biography that you see in programs and playbills that accompanied his first Broadway success, The Glass Menagerie, which some of you may have read, and which is, after all, set in St. Louis and concerns the playwright's attempt to escape from the place he called Saint Pollution. Williams never mentioned the place where he resided and called his address between the ages of 7 to 27, which, if you think about it, are pretty important formative years in a person's life, where you lived from the age of 7 to 27. But St. Louis is never mentioned in his bio. So the fact that this play is set in a tiny southern town called Glorious Hill is vital. It is where, in his imagination, Tennessee Williams did come from. Williams felt a special connection with Alma Winemiller, the main character of Summer and Smoke, which was written in 1947 and premiered on Broadway in 1948. Williams' connection with the play's central character was so strong that it might be considered something of an obsession. He not only wrote this play, but as you can see by the title of this talk, The Three Faces of Alma, he also wrote a short story on the same theme called The Yellow Bird, employing the same characters and themes, and even created a painting, an original painting, on this subject called When Summer and Smoke Were Past, which we will also see toward the end of the lecture. Taken together, the fact that Williams wrote a short story, a full-length play, and a painting, all using the same characters and themes, indicates something fairly obvious, doesn't it? That whatever it was that motivated the artist was of great significance personally. Clearly, he was trying out a variety of combinations of words and images to ascertain the proper shape for something important he needed to say, which transcended the specific artistic medium in which it was expressed. Now, I want you to reflect on that. So the medium, I would argue, was less important in some ways than what he wanted to communicate. Consequently, he was an interdisciplinary writer, thinker, painter. In addition to working in different mediums to tell his story, the theatrical history of the play Summer and Smoke bears traces of the subject's obsessive hold for the playwright. He was never satisfied with the result of this play, and he kept revising it for nearly 30 years. He worked on it just prior to the Broadway opening in 1948, and he revised it again in Rome prior to the play's 1951 premiere. Think of what that means. He had a reasonably successful Broadway opening, and he felt strongly enough so that within 3 years he decided to revise it substantially. According to Williams, he brought his revised copy of the play to London, but his producer told him that it was too late to incorporate the changes. If you've ever worked on an original play, you know what that means, that the playwright can come up with last-minute changes that the actors have to incorporate into their lines and to be able to own those lines. And in this case, the changes were too drastic. So he was dissatisfied, and he rewrote the play completely again in 1964 as a play called The Eccentricities of a Nightingale, and revised it yet again prior to the play's second Broadway debut in 1976. And this latter version was accompanied by a brief pre-opening essay in the New York Times with the title, quote, "I have rewritten a play for artistic purity," whatever that means. Sadly, this final revision was less successful than the original and only ran for about 24 performances on Broadway. Despite all its author's misgivings, Summer and Smoke is the version preferred today, and it is the lovely play that you have the opportunity to see here at the Smith Center for the Arts until October 9th, I believe. As befits his obsessive, fanatical attention to his work, and one of his friends in St. Louis, a poet that he worked closely with, who was also a student at Washington University, described his persistence. And he said, he described the fanatical and inexhaustible energy in his writing. His persistence was almost grotesque. It was Dionysian, demoniac. He wasn't aiming basically at material success. He wrote because it was a fatal need. Williams had very specific ideas about writing and very specific ideas about this play. And his production notes, which are published in the text of the play, were written with remarkable detail and exactitude. Don't expect those production details to be imitated in the production that we see, although it is close in certain important respects. I want to tell you something about those production notes because it tells you something about where the play was coming from. He begins with the sky, saying with some grandiosity in his note, first of all, the sky. I say it that way because the sky is capitalized and put in italics. The words the sky are written with that kind of prominence. And then he goes on to insist that, quote, there must be a great expanse of sky so that the entire action of the play takes place against it. And that this applies not merely to exterior scenes, but I think remarkably to the interior scenes as well. In other words, Williams wanted the sky to be present even when the characters were speaking indoors. Although the play tells the story of a rather simple romance between a girl and a boy in the small town of Glorious Hill, Mississippi, between the turn of the century and 1916, It is clear that for Williams, Alma's spiritual quest possessed cosmic significance out of proportion with its somewhat slight subject matter. And here is how he describes the features of the sky in precise, even loving detail. The sky should be a pure and intense blue, like the sky of Italy in the in the religious paintings of the Renaissance. And costumes should be selected to form dramatic color contrasts to this intense blue, which the figures stand out against. I'm glad we have the costume wardrobe mistress as well here in the production, at the talk. Color harmonies, he goes on, color harmonies and other visual effects are tremendously important. In the night scenes, the more familiar constellations such as Orion and the Great Bear and the Pleiades are clearly projected on the night sky, and above them is the nebulous radiance of the Milky Way. I mention this again not because this is done slavishly in the production. It isn't, nor should it be, but for another reason. Williams knew full well that every production, including the visually sumptuous one that is on now, is an autonomous creative act with its own designers and director, and that his meticulous stage directions were not going to be followed to the letter. Nonetheless, he wrote them because of the play's singular hold on his imagination. For those less familiar with this great American dramatist, and I imagine that for some of you, Summer and Smoke may be the only play that you've encountered. Maybe you haven't even read that one yet. Hopefully you've read some others, but I just want to underscore this. It should be mentioned that Williams approached all his writing obsessively, and using the word addiction to apply to it would not be wrong. He was a writing addict. And in fact, one of the ways in which he felt it separated him from his sister, who sadly suffered from a mental illness, was that he wrote. His compulsion was to write everything. So one might well ask why Williams was so focused on writing this play that he continued tinkering with it for close to 30 years. In a Playboy interview in the mid-1970s, Williams died in 1980. In 83. A Playboy interview in the mid-70s, he admitted that Alma Winemiller was his favorite of all the characters he had created in a long and illustrious career. This is what Williams said, including some details which we might prefer not to know. Alma is my favorite because I came out so late, and so did Alma. And she had the greatest struggle, you know. I didn't even masturbate until I was 27. I only had spontaneous orgasms and wet dreams. TMI. Right? Miss Alma grew up in the shadow of the rectory, and so did I. Her love was intense, but too late. Her man fell in love with someone else, and Miss Alma turned to a life of profligacy. I've been profligate. These comments permit, perhaps even insist, that we consider Summer and Smoke in relation to Williams' own life. This does not mean, of course, that the play is or should be seen as autobiographical or as autobiography. It is not. It is autobiographical. But Summer and Smoke was in some way the biography the author felt he had lived until he left St. Louis, he thought, for good, on his way to New Orleans at Christmas time in 1938, when his life changed completely, and he discovered who he really was as an artist and as a sexual being, as a gay man. Summer and Smoke, then, is the coming-of-age story of a girl sheltered by the world in which she is repressed by herself, by her parents, and by the belief system around her, as we see in the scenes of her comic scenes, of her intellectual circle. In a prologue, which is not normally performed, and it isn't performed in this production because it requires 2 child actors of age 10, we learn that in this prologue that Alma speaks and acts more like a grown-up than a young person. Her style of speech, her hypochondria, her nervousness, all, by the way, magnificently rendered by Kylie in this production, all reveal that she has suppressed her true emotions, her real self. John Buchanan, the young man whom she adores from early childhood on, and who is played with equal brilliance by Jack, and on whom she loses in the end, describes her as having a, quote, badly irritated doppelganger. Of course, this doppelganger is Alma's true self, straining to emerge from its cocoon. It is a self that she simultaneously both fears and desires, and which does not reveal itself until the very final moments of the play, when she picks up a traveling salesman and takes him with her to Moon Lake Casino. In a remarkable scene near the end of the play, Summer and Smoke, both Alma and John realize it is now too late for them to come together as lovers, a moment which Williams creates magically in the script by having John light a match, which is held until it nearly burns his fingers, at which point Alma blows it out. The stage directions read, "They both stare with a sorrowful understanding that is still perplexed. It is about to burn his fingers. She leans forward and blows it out. Then she puts on her gloves." And then the lovers speak to one another. John says, "I thought it was just a puritanical ice that glittered like flame, but now I believe it was flame, mistaken for ice." At the same time as John recognizes his true feelings for her, Alma realizes that her love for John was really more than chaste. Quote, "I came here to tell you that being a gentleman doesn't seem so important to me anymore, but you're telling me I've got to remain a lady. The tables have turned with a vengeance." At the beginning of their journey together, Alma is an innocent and believes in love as a transcendental ideal devoid of human touch, and compares her ideal of love to a Gothic cathedral in a very beautiful speech. I'll quote briefly from it. "How everything reaches up, how everything seems to be straining for something out of the reach of stone or human fingers. The immense stained windows, the great arched doors that are 5 or 6 times the height of the tallest man, the vaulted ceiling, and all the delicate spires, all reaching up to something beyond attainment. That is the secret, the principle back of existence." And that's what she has based her life upon. But Williams gives us a clue as to how we are supposed to view this message, this passage, when he concludes her monologue with this line. "Who was it that said, 'All of us are in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars'?" John simply answers, "Mr. Oscar Wilde." And this simple evocation of the Victorians' most disreputable figure, and sodomite, as he was then called, is enough to undercut Alma's lavish and idealized description of the cathedral, reminding the audience that the play began with a 10-year-old Alma and Johnny as children playing around the fountain with the stone angel, which is beautifully rendered in this production. Gorgeous image and lit. The scene is not included in the acting edition for the reasons that I described, because of the young actors, nor is it in this production, but it has great significance, and I will read briefly from it so that I can highlight its importance. Alma, this is the 10-year-old girl. "Do you know the name of the angel?" John. "Does she have a name?" Alma. "Yes, I found out she does. It's carved in the base, but it's all worn away so you can't make it out with your eyes." John. "Then how do you know it?" Alma. "You have to read it with your fingers. I did, and it gave me cold shivers. You read it and see if it doesn't give you cold shivers. Go on, read it with your fingers." This little passage, in some ways, contains in nuce the entire drama and what Alma and John, but particularly Alma, has to learn. While the 10-year-old Alma is able to discern the secret of eternity being touch, her grown-up self doesn't understand it until the end of the play, when, fortified by tablets that make her feel like a water lily on a Chinese lagoon, she meets this traveling salesman and takes him to the infamous Moon Lake Casino where anything goes. When the young man asks about the character of the place he's about to be taken to, Alma's response is, "Gay, very gay, Mr. Kramer," offering a sly wink to the audience and cementing the connection between Alma's liberation into a sexual being from the stone angel of Glorious Hill, whose body she now realizes is stone and whose blood is mineral water, and William's own coming out to himself as a gay man in New Orleans. Remember, the play was first produced in 1948, and though explicit references were not possible, but oblique references, of course, were. While working at the play, Williams also wrote a short story called The Yellow Bird, which was published in 1947 and then reprinted and in a collection called One Arm in 1948, the same year as the play. Although the tone of the story is stylistically much different from the more lyrical play, the two works are closely interconnected in ways that are illuminating. The story introduces the character of Alma Tutwiler, Winemiller in Summer and Smoke, of course, who reflects Tennessee Williams' own upbringing at his grandfather's rectory in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Young Alma in the story is essentially imprisoned by her puritanical family, headed by a Protestant minister and his obedient wife. The reader is told that the genealogy of the rector's family goes back to the Salem witch trials, where an ancestor was hanged as a witch, her own husband having joined in accusing her for afflicting a group of hysterical young girls, quote, and made them sign their names in the devil's book. The yellow bird of the story's title is described as the interlocutor between Alma's remote ancestor and the devil. By pointing out this association with witchcraft and the devil in Alma's remote past, Williams emphasizes Alma's rebellion against her family's religious strictures in the present and ultimately foreshadows her liberation and celebration of the flesh in opposition to Puritan repression. Alma's parents in the story, unlike the play, are mere caricatures of religious prudery and stale convention. Convinced, for example, that a young woman who smokes, quote, takes an irretrievable step toward perdition. If Alma gets to smoking, the Reverend informs Mrs. Tutwiler on a regular basis, quote, I'm going to denounce her from the pulpit and put her out of the house. At the very thought, quote, Alma's mother would scream and go into a faint, as she knew that every girl who is driven out of her father's house goes right into a good time house. Mrs. Tutwiler, by the way, embodies a grotesquely exaggerated Puritanism combined with the playwright's mother, Edwina Williams' notoriously orchestrated emotional collapses. Alma's break with her family occurs early in the story, so it's much more direct than it is in the play, and it happens early on. Seeing her father putting the congregation to sleep, and maybe some of you can identify with this right now, I hope not. She deliberately slams down her hymn book during the service, signaling the abrupt start of her quest for freedom. When her father slaps her for daring to smoke, she slaps him back, obliging her to leave the rectory. But not before she peroxides her hair, wears lipstick, and crashes the family car. Now, in the compressed form of the short story, Alma instantaneously abandons family and small-time life, small town life in the Mississippi Delta for a life, in this case, of prostitution on the notorious Monkey Wrench corner of New Orleans, just as Williams, born in Columbus, Mississippi, discovered his own sexual identity in the quarter. It is important to realize, though, that Alma's descent into debauchery and prostitution is not in the story presented as merely a failure or sin, but rather as a kind of liberation. Quote, she seemed to prosper in her new life. She has, quote, kicked over the traces of her past and jumped right back to the plumed hat cavaliers of bygone years. Williams himself referred to his background, his descendants, as a combination of Puritanism and Cavalier, a strain of the Cavalier. And if you watch the play, think about how often plumed hats are mentioned. Not something an audience really usually sees or thinks about, but it's important. Anybody watching this production will realize, however, that it's an important symbol of transgression and liberation. Mrs. Winemiller, Alma's mother, steals a plumed hat. And at the very end of the play, Alma wears one herself. Feathers here are, I think, a symbol of freedom from constraint. Early in the play, John encourages Alma to wear a hat with a plume. And when she complains that she doesn't have one, he simply replies, get one. I think we can read that line for more than the words actually dictate. Getting a plume is John's encouragement for Alma to embrace the doppelganger, if you like. Once Alma discovers herself in the quarter, I'm talking about the story now, the story jumps into a surreal mode, and the narrator warns the reader that the tale is about to take a detour that may be objectionable, quote, if any still hoped it was going to avoid the fantastic, unquote. Alma gives birth to a son without ever knowing who the father is, and this bewitched child leaves the house each morning and returns each evening with miraculous treasures, quote, his fists full of gold and jewels that smelled of the sea. One of the things that was mentioned in the class this morning was how Williams subtly reconstitutes symbols, that the angel may not be the same angel that we normally associate. I think Alma is a more complicated character, and her bewitching, if you like, has more meanings than simply the way we would think about it in an Orthodox context. After her death, Alma's wealth is appropriately bequeathed to a home for reckless spenders. The story takes on this very surreal, almost comic tone, and it abruptly concludes by describing a strange monument erected in Alma's honor, adorned with three figures of indeterminate gender astride a leaping dolphin. These figures celebrate the playwright's embrace of his homosexuality in New Orleans, while the fact that the three figures bear a crucifix, cornucopia, and a Grecian lyre suggests a kind of holy trinity of spirit, worldly success, and poetic inspiration. At the end of the story, the author reappears to remind us, the reader, that Bobo, the name of the small yellow bird that the devil and Goody Tutwiler had used as a go-between, is inscribed on the base of the monument, linking Alma's ancestral past with the escape from her religious upbringing. Although his repeated efforts to revise the themes of Alma's quest suggest both the playwright's preoccupation and dissatisfaction, in a painting executed in the same year as the play was developed, perhaps he managed somehow to bring these intangible qualities to canvas that never completely satisfied him on stage. And now I'm going to show you the painting that he did. This painting is, here it is. I hope you can see it. Yes, I think you can see it. The painting is called By That Time, as you can see. Summer and smoke were past, and then an ellipsis, and then he scrawls, he writes right on the canvas the name Hart Crane, the poet who authored those lines. So the title, Summer and Smoke, were taken from a poem by one of Williams' heroes, the American poet Hart Crane. And so this is a slide. Williams did paint. He started painting in the late 30s, and he continued it for the rest of his life. Williams' painting succeeds not because of sophisticated draftsmanship, which it lacks, but because it conveys the play's central themes with light, color, and above all, a kind of directness. Instead of Alma's backstory and a flood of secondary characters and situations, Williams tells his story in a single unified image of Alma's journey. In the painting, the girl is, as you can see, depicted nude, and her features are delicate and angelic, reminiscent perhaps of a Botticelli angel. She is seen in profile with one bare breast against the background of a sky of pale blue, pink, and yellow. The mountains are visible, and there are birds flying overhead. And with just these few simple brushstrokes, I would say, Williams conveys Alma's pure spirituality as she is seen almost floating against the sky. Now, in his introduction to the collected stories, that Williams was also a very important short story writer. For those of you who are less interested in theater and more interested in fiction, you should read them, including The Yellow Bird, of course. But Gore Vidal, who edited the book of his short stories, recalls how his nickname for Williams was Glorious Bird. And this is what he said. I called him the Glorious Bird. The image of the bird is everywhere. The bird is flight, poetry, life. The bird is time, death. Remember, too, what we've said just now about the plumes in the play. I think that this is also related to us being a symbol of freedom. With the birds flying overhead in the painting, combined with Alma's floating figure, the image is reminiscent of an exquisite description by Valentine Xavier, a character in another play of Williams, less known, called Orpheus Descending. And this is what the character of Val, as he's called, says. You know, there's a kind of bird that don't have legs, so it can't light on nothing, but has to stay all its life on wings in the sky. That's true. It had a body as tiny as your little finger and so light on the palm of your hand it didn't weigh more than a feather. But its wings spread out this wide, but they was transparent, the color of the sky, and you could see through them. This image of Alma floating against the sky suggests that Williams was depicting his alter ego as pure spirit, the legless bird of Val's story. However, this image of pure spirituality is complicated, isn't it? By her nakedness, and especially by the right hand of the figure plunging downward. The object it seeks to connect with is another, much larger, presumably male hand. And the real subject of the painting is the powerful connection between these two hands. The woman's gaze is turned down toward the man's hand, and it in turn reaches up to her. The male figure, as you can see, is not depicted, only this one hand, but his unseen presence is palpable. As in the play, the two oppositional figures are never able to connect, and as a result, this powerful image is loaded with tension. The nearly touching hands, and we can think, if you like, of the Sistine Chapel as a possible motif that Williams may have been thinking about. But in any case, the two nearly touching hands exquisitely mirror the dualism and tragic sense of a missed opportunity observed between John and Alma in the play. The nearly touching fingers create a sense of tension, of attraction based on the anticipation of a meeting on the cusp of consummation that can never be actually achieved. Although the painting does not illustrate any scene from the play, it captures, I would argue, its essence in visual terms. The play is rich with moments where the two characters are in this situation where they almost seem about to connect but do not. One such mention I already mentioned, one such moment I mentioned when John lights the match and stands holding it, nearly burning his fingers, and Alma blows it out, an action immediately following by her covering her bare hands with her gloves, while the stage directions read, "They both stare at it with a sorrowful understanding that is still perplexed." Although there are several other instances in the play where Williams suggests that Alma and John might touch, none of these images is quite so thoroughly realized as in his own painting, where the image of missed connections becomes the entire focus of the work. There is yet another aspect of this painting that usefully illuminates both play and the yellow bird. And this is going to be a little bit difficult for you to see on the slide, despite the clarity of this image. At the top of the canvas, there's a crisscrossing pattern that does not extend to the whole painting. Can you see that? Okay. All right. Beneath this these crisscrossed hatching lines that seem almost like the bars of a cell, there is another object that is very faintly visible, but I've inspected the painting and I'm sure it's there, and I don't know if you can come up with it or you believe me, but it's a rose window in that area above, and it's very hard to see, but it's up there. And I think it's quite significant that it is there. This image was almost certainly inspired by a church Williams knew well from childhood, the St. Paul's Episcopal Church, where he was baptized. This was the Rose Window Little Church where Williams' grandfather, the Reverend Walter E. Dakin, had his first appointment in the town of Church Hill, Mississippi, a name strongly reminiscent of Glorious Hill, the fictional town of the play. At the very end of one of the sequels, it's not really a sequel, it's a retelling, called The Eccentricities of a Nightingale, the final iteration of the play that began some 30 years before, Alma cements this connection between word and image as she points out the church to the young salesman, Archie, as she is preparing to seduce. And this is what she says. "There is the Episcopal Church," Alma says. "My father was rector of it before his death. It had an unusual steeple." So she's linking these two things. The allusion to a church in the background of Williams' painting is, of course, hardly accidental. All three works, The Yellow Bird, Summer and Smoke, When Summer and Smoke Were Past, follow a common thread, the story of a young woman's journey from religious confinement to spiritual and sexual liberation, from the restraints of an outdated Puritanism to sexual promiscuity to what? In the play, Alma's naive innocence was defined by her admiration for the Gothic cathedral, how everything reaches up, how everything seems to be straining for something out of the reach of stone or human fingers. So in the painting, the church has receded deep into the background behind bars in favor of the two lovers' incipient encounter and the nearly meeting hands, touch, which are the painting's chief subject. In this painting, then, Williams allows us to see Alma's angelic, nude form on the cusp of her realization and triumph over the confining ideals of her glorious hill past. In this neglected but remarkable painting, Williams manages not only to illustrate his own journey and the play's central action, he's created an image connecting all three works, the story, the play, and the painting, in a single image of Alma transcending her religious confinement through the healing power, again, of touch. Interesting, and I'll conclude with this, both Alma and Williams were the same age when they underwent their respective transformations. Alma to the understanding that love involves touch rather than an idealized or spiritual notion of love, while Williams, who was raised by a puritanical mother, who, like Alma, was the daughter of a minister, discovered his sexual identity as a gay man and a wholly different side to himself from what the middle-class young Tom, you can look at Williams' life as a debate, as a conflict, excuse me, between Tom and Tennessee, and what this middle-class young Tom was used to in St. Louis. The change, as I said, occurred when he visited New Orleans at Christmas time in 1938 for the first time at the age of 27. This is what Williams wrote in his notebook just 3 hours after arriving in New Orleans by bus. Imagine dressed in a very conservative suit. He got off the bus and he wrote in his journal, because he lived through his notebooks and his writing, "I am delighted, in fact enchanted with this glamorous, fabulous old town. I've been here about 3 hours, but have already wandered about the Vieux Carré and noted many exciting possibilities. Here surely is the place I was made for, if any place in this funny old world." And here's an excerpt from a poem called Mornings on Bourbon Street, which conveys, I think, something of the same sense of exploration that Alma feels at the end of the play as she contemplates going with a traveling salesman to Moonlight Casino, presumably for a sexual encounter. Quote, "He thought of the rotten sweet odor the quarter had, so much like a warning of what he would have to learn. He thought of belief and the gradual loss of belief, and the piercing together of something like it again. He wept for remembrance. But when he had finished weeping, he washed his face. He smiled at his face in the mirror, preparing to say to you, whom he was expecting, 'Love, love, love.' But could he believe it again?" That's how the poem ends. We'll stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you. Oh, I was going to show you, I'm sorry, I forgot to show you the slides. This is Williams and his mother in Clarksdale. I mentioned that he lived in the Deep South until the age of 7. And his grandfather, who's very fond, by the way, of his grandparents, and that's an important distinction with the play and the short story, that he loved his grandparents. It was his parents that he had a lot of problems with, which I could talk to you about if you're interested. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the background a little bit. Edwina Williams was born actually in Ohio. It goes back to our question of where were you born, where are you from. But she spoke with a deep Southern accent, and she basically presented as a Southern belle her entire life. So it's interesting about the idea of identity versus birthplace. She was the rector's daughter, the beautiful rector's daughter, and she, in some ways, always played that role. Here is Williams is second from the left. His mother is in the center, and his grandmother, is on the right. Rose, with the doll, is down stage, as it were, on the ground. And in the extreme left-hand corner is Ozzie, who is the family nurse. And it was Ozzie who Williams, in many respects, felt had made him a writer. She used to tell stories, and he was devastated when she left. And so she's an important character in his story, much more than you would think a nurse would be. This is his father. He had a lot of problems with his father. His father was many things, a kind of a bully, an alcoholic, a gambler. He had his ear bitten off once in a bar fight. He ridiculed what he considered Tom's effeminacy, called him Miss Nancy in the house. At the same time, he was very warm toward Tom's younger brother, Dakin, though. They used to listen to the Cardinals games on the radio. But Williams always tried to find the love of his father. And as he got older, he felt in some ways that he had misrepresented his father, or that his father was a kind of surrogate self. If any of you have read Glass Menagerie, you know that the father is not in the family, although he was at the time that the play is set in the 1930s. He was still in the home, but he is depicted in Glass Menagerie as a telephone man who fell in love with long distance. And he's almost something that to be aspired toward. He's not seen as a bully. He's seen as a kind of, a sort of talisman, somebody to become like. In the final monologue of Glass Menagerie, he talks about following in his father's footsteps. So the relationships are more complex than they seem. Now I wanted to show you this because this is the passenger depot in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where he was born. It was a very, very small town. And although Williams wanted to go back to this world and did go back to it in his imagination, one wonders what would have happened if he had stayed there. Because in St. Louis, he was exposed to a greater sophistication and a terrific educational system. And his talents for writing were singled out in high school. He went to University City High School. So it's not all black and white. Life is not like that. But this is the juxtaposition that I told you about between Clarksdale and Union Station. This is the same year. So you can imagine first of all, what a difficult transition it would be for a 7-year-old. And I told you about the fact that his first remembrance that he puts in his memoir was of being slapped in the hand for taking a grape off a vendor's truck. So St. Louis was something that was associated throughout his life with the curbing of instincts. And think about that in relation to the play also, to Summer and Smoke, how important instinct is. And that's the thing that Alma finally starts to act on at the very end of the play, perhaps. Here they are in St. Louis. They were miserable in St. Louis. The main reason was the beautiful relationship with his grandparents was gone. So now it was much more the nuclear family. And the parents fought constantly because of C.C., was his name, Cornelius Williams, his womanizing and his drinking and so forth. And Edwina was very much really established a kind of puritanical approach to the household. Dakin called her president of the non-sex league. So she did not want touch in the house. There was no touch. There was no warmth in Williams' house. And I think you see some of that neglect in coming through in this play. Now this is Lorette Taylor, who was famous for playing Amanda Wingfield in the Glass Menagerie. And it is said, and I believe it to be true, that when his mother came to see, this is very much based upon Amanda, her language, her look, everything, that when Amanda came to see the production, Lorette Taylor said, "Well, how does it feel to see yourself on stage, Mrs. Wingfield?" And she looked back and she said, "I don't see any connection. The only thing we have in common is we both like jonquils." So she never saw it, but of course, you'll see it, even if you don't know. You'll see that it's William's mother. And I wanted to show this because he was very fond of, this is the rector, this is Reverend Dakin, Walter Dakin, and he lived well into his 90s. And Williams amazingly maintained his relationship, a close relationship with him, even took him on road trips with him to Florida. He was deeply fond of his grandparents. Again, life is sometimes more complicated than seeing one thing or the other. This I wanted to show you too, because Williams alludes to this in the stage directions of the play. I don't know if the actors saw it or not, but it's a painting by Italian artist De Chirico, and Williams references it when he talks about the interiors being permeated by the sky and by not having the walls between rooms. So I could talk about it at length, but it's not. I just wanted to show it to you. This is Joe Milziner, who was a great designer, who designed Summer and Smoke. He also designed Streetcar Named Desire and Death of a Salesman, for those of you that are interested. He was a premier designer at the time, just so you can see. And Milziner was very complimentary about those, you could say, overwritten design production notes. He said, it would be impossible to design a bad production of Summer and Smoke if one took into account Williams' visual sense. And I think that in some ways that's true. Williams had a very, very strong sense of the visual. And that's it. Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Do we have some time left for?
Yeah, we do. We do. So it's tradition in the forum that a student asks the first question. So
Pressure.
students, where are you? Going to my students. Maybe have questions. Anthony, I see you. Oh, okay. You got one, Luke? Great.
Yeah, there's a question here.
Love it.
So, what would you say is your favorite Tennessee Williams play, and what was the first Tennessee Williams play that you've experienced?
My favorite play is unquestionably Streetcar Named Desire. I think it's the greatest American play ever written. I mean, in some ways, that's an easy one. And I could explain at length, but I won't, because I know more student questions are forthcoming. The other part of the question was my first exposure. It was in high school. I remember it. It was reading Glass Menagerie. And I felt I identified with Tom Wingfield and what he was going through. And I remember, how many of you have read or seen Glass Menagerie? So, a good number. One thing particularly affected me, I think, if I think back on that time, and it was the fact that his mother confiscated his copy of D.H. Lawrence. And I just felt, I could sense that idea of the mother's invasion of his space. I guess it was very similar to what I was going through or felt I was going through at the time. My life is somehow, this is taking it a step further than the question, but my life has oddly become entwined with Williams in a way that, has surprised me. Because I had that experience in high school. I'm from New York, but and born in New York. But when I went to Holland, I had the opportunity to direct Glass Menagerie in the Netherlands, of all places. And so I started to do research. Then when I took the job that was in 1980, 81, something like that. Then when I took the job at Washington University, I found out that Williams had gone there. That was obviously not why I took the job. But it was a strange coincidence. And then I was told that he had written a play while he was at Washington University, a one act, and it hadn't been published. Did I want to read it? And I thought, well, I'll save this for something. I read it. I didn't think much of it. And then I ended up it's very odd. So anyway, the play was done. I went to New Orleans to talk at a scholars conference about this play and how it was performed, because it hadn't been published. It was published in 2011. And I was in a bookstore there, and I found Williams flunked out of Wash U for 2 reasons. I mean, he flunked out because he failed the final exam in Greek. The other reason was this play, because he was 26 years old as an undergraduate. And when the play was read aloud, they laughed at it. They thought it was ridiculous. It was about, I was telling Aaron about it, this armaments manufacturer and his crazy wife in the bedroom, and they didn't see. Anyhow, I was in New Orleans talking about the play, the one act, and I found his Greek exam. I mean, this is really, how weird is that? I was in a bookstore and I asked if they had any sort of things about Tennessee Williams, any memorabilia. They had some signed copies, and they gave me a sheaf of paper. I looked through it, and I found his Greek exam. And then it gets weirder, because I was thumbing through the Greek exam, and I saw D+, F, C, whatever it was, and for some reason I turned the last page, and there was a poem. There was an original poem that he had written while he was failing the Greek exam, which I had published. Actually the New Yorker took it on, and so it was very strange. And then some years went by, and I had a friend who was the costume designer for Glass Menagerie in the Netherlands come to visit, and she stayed with us a month. And she said, "You know what I wanted?" She had designed the costumes for Glass Menagerie, and she said, "I want to find something about Tennessee Williams and his relationship to St. Louis." I said, "Well, go to the History Museum. It's got to be there." And she couldn't find it. And I said, "Well, I'll check the library," and I couldn't find anything. Because, as I said, he lived there from 7 to 27. Nobody has written more about an American dramatist or no dramatist has been more written about than Williams. And there was nothing. And so she challenged me to write it, to write this story of Tennessee Williams and his relation to St. Louis. And so I wrote it, and that's how the book started. But what's interesting, and not to show you that, but what's interesting is the poem. If we have time, I'll read it to you, because I think you might like it. But go ahead. While I'm doing this, you can ask other questions.
Questions? Other questions? Other questions? Oh, yeah.
Yes. Forgive me if I don't look at you while you're asking.
So I watched the movie with Geraldine Page.
Yes.
And I must say I was perplexed on how I was intended to read the ending, because to me there's no winning. It's a tragedy of sorts. I can imagine if it's read, Alma is read in some way, like Tennessee Williams understanding his own sexuality and such. But that's not how I saw the play. The play is a tragedy. Where Tom, is that his name? His name?
Yes.
Tom goes off to an actual healthy life, and she goes off to she's a little bit past age, and there's something pathetic about her trying to seduce this salesman. So I saw it as a terrible, again, it's not a criticism of the ending,
No.
but a very sad and terrible ending for this woman, and that she was sort of destroyed by this man.
I'd rather, it's very interesting that the microphone is already in your hands. I'd rather you respond to this.
Oh.
I think you're much more capable than, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
It clearly can be played that way.
Yeah, I always feel, for those of you who don't know, I directed the production that
whole
some
world
of these
knows.
students are but I think that, to Jim's point, I think the wonderful thing about theater is that it is asking audiences to come to their own conclusions. So what I feel the end of this play is about probably is not necessarily consequential to your experience, Jim, because that was the experience you had, which is, I think, what Tennessee Williams and well, probably not Tennessee Williams, but what many playwrights want is for you all to make those decisions on your own. But I will say, just because you're asking, that for me, this play is a becoming of Alma. So instead of it being that she has been changed, it is actually she is finally becoming the person who she has been the entire time. And so it's an opening.
There's also the question of historical context of when the film was made and what audiences. When was the film made? Do you know? I don't.
60s, I think.
Early 60s, right? I mean, it's a time that, there is a sense of virtue being rewarded, and to see Alma's descent in a particularly moralistic perspective that I don't know that we would have today. And the question is, how, again, as you say, how open-ended is it? What did Tennessee Williams intend? It is open, I think, and it can be done that way, but I don't think it's as successful, certainly not today. I'm curious about, we have the luxury of having Alma in the audience. Any thoughts?
I think that when I was first reading the play, I didn't have any knowledge of it before I auditioned for the show, and I really had to spend a lot of time with it, learning who the character was and the context of the story. I definitely had an interpretation similar to yours when I was first digging into the text, of thinking, this is really sad. I don't think that I would be happy if I lost the love of my life. I don't know if that's how I would heal myself, but I eventually found, through a lot of exploration, that I can see how the point isn't so much for her to find, let me see how to word this. Her happy ending is supposed to be non-conformative, I think, in a way. So it might mean more that to others, her ending is kind of sad, but it isn't to her. I think there's a message in that in of itself, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
What did you say?
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's a terrific answer, much better than I could.
Yeah, great.
Because I think that it is her answer to herself. I think that's beautifully put.
Yep.
And see, that's a reason to go to see a play. It's not because we necessarily know the answer. It's the questions that it provides. And I'm not sure that Williams, again, think about the time in which it was written in the late 40s, if he could have put, assuming that she goes into a life of prostitution, which I don't know that is true, but she certainly does that one action. It was bound to be seen in one light. It wasn't something that would be seen open-ended, but I think Kylie's interpretation is a very valid one. And every one of us needs to think about it when they see the production. Production doesn't necessarily, am I right, doesn't answer the question either. It leaves it up to the audience to a large degree. We talked about it in the morning class or whenever it was today at some length. That's really a great answer.
Is there another student question before we move to, you think one more question? Kevin, last one.
So how do you, as someone who studied Williams, he kind of was working during a profound time of censorship in the arts in the United States, especially in Hollywood, but also in Broadway, where at one time actors were arrested for doing obscene things on stage.
Yes.
How did that era, do you think, play into Williams' artistic sensibilities, I suppose, and how it ties into his life?
That's such a profound question. It's not one that I'm fully able to answer. I would recommend you take a look at it if you're interested in following this up. There's a book written by colleagues of mine, Robert Bray and Barton Palmer, called Hollywood's Tennessee, which deals with the question of censorship in Hollywood, which is really interesting. And it varied from film to film. But as most of you will know who have read Streetcar, how many have read Streetcar or seen it? Yeah. Of course, there's a rape scene at the end of Streetcar. There's a lot of violence in Tennessee Williams. This play is an exception in a way. And, of course, they had to decide how to handle that. And there was the Hayes Act at the time. The film was made in 1951 by Elia Kazan. And of course, that act was something that was mandated that virtue be rewarded and that bad behavior be punished. So how do you handle that? And it's brilliant. If you've never seen the film of Streetcar Named Desire, to me it's a masterpiece of how to navigate the waters of censorship. Because what happens, and I don't think it's a shame to tell you, what happens is that at the moment of the sexual violence and sexual attack, there's a shattered mirror. And so the audience has a sense of what has happened. And then there's a spraying of a hose on the street, which you have in New Orleans, so you get a sense of the sexuality of it. Then at the end of the play, Stella is Stanley's wife, of course, and she leaves. Now, in the play, she doesn't. In the play, we have the last line is, the name of the game is 7-card stud. And things are back to how they were. In the film, Stella runs up the winding staircase and leaves. But then the camera does something amazing. It pans back out, and then we see the quarter like a bird's eye view of the quarter. And we are reminded, inevitably, of an earlier scene after Stanley has committed an act of violence. He slapped his wife, and he's thrown a radio out of the window, and how, again, Stella has come back to him. He has begged for forgiveness, and the way that the camera operates, you have to decide again for yourself if I'm right, but the way that the camera operates, it sort of reminds us, on one hand, it fulfills the Hollywood bargain, in which case the virtue is ill virtue is punished, but it also reminds us of the inevitability of a return, that these two lovers are going to come back. So it has it both ways. Some wouldn't agree with my reading of this film, but I think it was, you're raising a very central point. Williams is writing about this, and now I haven't even talked about his own personal life, because that's relevant here too. I mean, when he says it's gay, very gay, gay would have been a word that could have been used without necessarily any sort of overtones in 1948. People would have thought of gay as happy. In 1916, they would have seen it as what it is, as meaning happy. In 1948, it had taken, I don't know the etymology in detail, but by the 40s or late 40s and 50s, it would have been usage in America. So it's, again, how does he handle it? You can read it on both levels.
Yeah. Thank you, Henry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please head to the great room and enjoy the reception. Thank you.